Hero Perseus cut off Medusa's head and returned with glory and honor. That's how the story ends, isn't it? You're wrong, because from that day on, the golden hero couldn't sleep peacefully for a single night. Can you hear those dry, rustling sounds and snake hissing coming from beneath his bed? Because you can destroy a monster, but you can never silence its scream. Noctivara Stories begins. Welcome into the shadows tonight as we dissect the utterly chaotic realm of the primordial Greek pantheon. A world governed by deities so volatile, so vengeful, and so dangerously broken. Before we descend further into this abyss, remember to strike that like button and lock in your subscription. But only if you crave this darkness as much as I do. Leave a whisper in the comment section below. Where on this fading earth are you watching from? And what hour is it in your time zone? It is chillingly beautiful to watch the world gather in the dark. Now extinguish the flames around you. Let a low hum fill the room. And let us step into the cold currents of tonight's chronicle. Let us confront the supreme tyrant first. Zeus, the master of the skies, lord of the mount, and living proof that ultimate dominion rots every fiber of restraint. Born the youngest spawn of Cronus and Rhea, his legacy was carved in blood. His sire, driven by cosmic paranoia, devoured his newborn children whole to choke out any future rebellion. Quite a tragic welcome. Yet, Rhea deceived her husband, presenting him a heavy stone wrapped in cloth, saving the infant Zeus, a testament to how easily blinded by malice these tyrants were. Upon reaching maturity, Zeus sparked a catastrophic war against Cronus, tearing his father's flesh open to vomit out his devoured kin, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, Hera, and Demeter. Thus, the primeval empire of divine dysfunction was cemented. Once the Titans fell, Zeus claimed the high throne. He wielded the thunderbolt, commanded the storms, and dictated cosmic law and sacred oaths. Or so the myths claim. In truth, the Sky Father spent eons shifting shapes into beasts to hunt down anything with a heartbeat. A swan, a bull, a raptor, a shroud of gold mist. The king possessed no temperance, no moral anchor. Picture the highest judge of your land morphing into a predatory bird to prey on mortals. That is Zeus, cloaked in cosmic lightning. His domestic life was a fractured nightmare. He wedded his sister, Hera, an alliance forged in venom. His endless seductions birthed a legion of demigods, children abandoned to the cruel whims of fate, destined to forge their own blood-soaked legends. Yet, he was more than just a feral beast. Between his acts of betrayal and striking down mortals who neglected his altars, he operated as the ultimate cosmic warden. He enforced the laws of hospitality, crushed the proud, and punished those who dared match his own boundless arrogance. Zeus was worshipped with terror, a permanent stain on the nobility of Olympus. He was the judge and the criminal, the shepherd and the wolf, the ultimate paradox of power. Hera rules over the sacred bonds of matrimony, lineage, and labor, an irony sweeter than poison given that her own throne is bound to a perpetual nightmare. She is the queen, yes, but also Zeus's sister, sharing a lineage of primordial horror. Their holy union was meant to stand as the blueprint for cosmic order. Instead, it dissolved into an eternal tragedy of betrayal, spite, and mortals morphed into weeping stone or beasts. Hera is formidable, the undisputed sovereign of the heavens. Yet her majesty manifests almost entirely through a single, terrifying medium, retribution. Not directed at Zeus, of course. To strike the king would end the illusion. No, Hera's malice is a laser focused on the helpless women her husband defiled, and the tragic bastards they bear. She condemned a maiden to wander as a beast, locked another's voice into a hollow echo, and dispatched venomous vipers to strangle the infant Hercules in his cradle. The cycle of horror never ceased. It is difficult to completely condemn her fury. Picture being the guardian of holy vows while your partner invents new animal disguises to desecrate your name. Deprived of any salvation, her only coping mechanism was the creation of immortal curses. In the ancient world, revenge was the only sanctuary. Yet, Hera was not merely a bitter phantom. She shielded women in their darkest hours, upheld the structures of civilization, and broke those who forswore their oaths. Empires like Argos trembled before her altars, fearing the plagues she would unleash if her name was dishonored. She remains a haunting archetype, a symbol of majestic dignity trapped in a pantheon designed to degrade her. Her myth is not one of mere jealousy. It is the tragedy of a queen holding a breaking world together with pure, unadulterated spite. Poseidon commanded the dark abysses, the tremors of the earth, and the wild spirits of horses. A strange beast for an ocean lord, but logic has no home in the dark age of myth. Among the three primordial brothers, he inherited the drowning depths. While Zeus took the heavens and Hades took the grave, Poseidon claimed the black waters. He ruled the trackless oceans, birthed monstrosities that still haunt the deep, and carried the trident, a weapon not for fishing, but a conduit of tectonic wrath capable of shattering continents. Mortals whispered his name with trembling lips. Navigators starved his altars with gold for safe passage. Coastal cities begged his mercy before laying a single brick, lest their walls be swallowed by a sudden, furious tide. But let us look past the majesty. Poseidon was a volatile entity, driven by waves of fragile ego and salt-bitten rage. He was the tempest personified. One day he would raise an island from the froth. The next, he would drown an innocent valley because a priest forgot his tribute. When Athena bested him for the patronage of Athens, offering a simple olive tree while he offered a useless salt spring, the sea god chose catastrophic vengeance over grace. The people chose nourishment. He chose to drown their plains. His couplings were no less destructive, leaving a trail of ruined lives, including a tragic maiden named Medusa, who paid the price for his intrusion with a crown of serpents while he walked away untarnished. Yet he was vital. He was the anchor of seafaring empires, the foundation of coastal realms, and, in his rare moments of stillness, a harbinger of abundance. But like the black ocean he governed, he was always a single heartbeat away from dragging the world into the abyss. Hades rules the silent domain of the dead. Not a pit of hellfire, but an endless, gray twilight where every mortal soul eventually report for their final, eternal silence. Contrary to modern tales, the Lord of the Grave was neither sinister nor malicious. He was simply exhausted. When the cosmos was divided, Hades drew the shortest straw, condemned to run the eternal bureaucracy of human mortality. Forever locked in the damp dark, listening to the muffled weeping of ghosts, he governed with a quiet, unyielding discipline. He lacked the theatrical vanity of his brothers. He didn't shatter weddings or hurl lightning. He simply showed up to maintain the borders of the afterlife, ensuring no soul ever escaped back to the light. The ultimate warden of eternity. His kingdom bore his own name, an omen of finality. It was segmented into fields: the heroic Elysium, the numb plains of Asphodel, and the agonizing void of Tartarus, the universe's deepest dungeon. And Hades oversaw every ledger, the true workaholic of the pantheon. Then comes Persephone. Yes, he dragged her from the sun-drenched earth. A dark beginning. Yet, within the twisted logic of myth, theirs became the only functional, loyal marriage in the divine court. She reigned at his side for half the year, bringing a cold majesty to the underworld, before returning to the surface to trigger the spring. A grim, supernatural compromise. Hades loved only his duty and his three-headed hound, Cerberus, a beast of raw fury that kept the ghosts in their place. Unlike his kin, the Lord of the Dead never cheated, never threw tantrum pageants, and never sought the adoration of mortals. Perhaps that is why temples to his name were so rare. To build one was to invite the gaze of the grave. He was the silent, pale uncle waiting at the end of all things, respected from a distance, feared in the dark. Athena stands as the goddess of cold intellect, military strategy, and lethal foresight. She is the lone pillar of sanity in an empire of emotional ruins. Her very genesis is a psychological horror story. Zeus, after devouring his pregnant consort Metis to outsmart a prophecy, suffered an agonizing, skull-splitting torment. Shunning all ordinary cures, he endured a shattering hammer blow directly to his head. From that visceral wound emerged Athena, completely matured, clad in cold steel, and utterly contemptuous of the lesser beings around her. From her first breath, the maiden made it absolute that she would brook no foolishness. In stark contrast to her bloodthirsty brother Ares, Athena approached grand warfare like a grand cosmic chessboard, a grim science to be calculated, mastered, and won with absolute silence and lethal precision. If Ares embodied a mindless, chaotic tavern brawl, Athena was the supreme war room executing flawless devastation. She also governed the sacred crafts, an attribute that sounds peaceful until you witness weaving transformed into a ruthless battlefield beneath her fingers. Look no further than Arachne, a mortal foolish enough to challenge the goddess to a grand weaving duel. The maiden excelled technically, yet she was subsequently twisted into a wretched spider for possessing a gift that rivaled divinity. The lesson of her tragedy is simple: crouch in humility, or spend eternity spinning threads in the forgotten corners of a rotting ceiling. Athena remained entirely untainted by the carnal sins of romance. Unlike her degenerate kin on Olympus, she never pursued mortals, never wedded her brothers, and never assumed the shapes of predatory beasts. She simply had designs to fulfill. Cities to garrison, legendary kings to guide, nocturnal owls to command. She steered Odysseus through the dark tides, aided Perseus in severing Medusa's head, and effectively edited the triumphs of the Iliad with a blade of pure intellect. Athena is the phantom you desperately want anchoring your council, anchoring your vanguard, or steering your crumbling empire. She never rages. She never blunders. She simply bleeds you dry through superior strategy. Ares reigned as the savage lord of slaughter, violence, and striking without a single thought. If Athena approached war with a pristine blueprint, Ares met it with a heavy sledgehammer and non-existent impulse control. He personified the mindless, gory meat grinder of the front lines, the horrific theater where screaming warriors butchered one another in thick fog, completely blind to the larger tide, knowing only that the earth was burning and their armor was filling with blood. In short, whenever Ares descends upon a battlefield, the world becomes deafening, monstrous, and utterly unhinged. In terms of character, he was hardly the most cherished guest upon Mount Olympus. Even his divine parents loathed his presence. Zeus once openly condemned him as the most repulsive abomination among the pantheon. And you know your soul is rotted when the sky tyrant himself brands you an unredeemable plague. Ares was bloated with pride, hot-tempered, and possessed all the subtlety of a roaring, blood-drenched chariot. Nor did he command true reverence. The Greeks venerated cold discipline, patience, and cunning, virtues Ares consistently trampled underfoot. He never achieved victory through tactical brilliance. He simply charged into the fray swinging wildly. That sufficed against peasants, but more often than not, it yielded a harvest of slaughtered allies and deeply frustrated kings. Yet, one cannot deny the raw terror he projected. He was the literal patron of dread. His monstrous offspring were named Phobos and Deimos, panic and terror personified, and he thrived exclusively within the screaming heart of a massacre. He also maintained an infamous affair with Aphrodite, a tryst that sounds alluring until you remember it concluded with him trapped in an invisible golden net forged by her husband Hephaestus, exposed to the mocking laughter of the entire pantheon. The gossips of the ancient world feasted upon his humiliation for centuries. In Roman lore, his image received a severe modification as Mars, disciplined, majestic, less sweaty. But in Greece, he remained the feral, muscle-bound manifestation of raw brutality. Still, the slaughter lord had his purposes. In times of total ruin, he was feared and appeased. Legions bled sacrifices at his altars, praying he would grant them iron skin or simply bypass their villages entirely. And when he wasn't destroying civilizations, he traversed the night sky in a magnificent chariot drawn by stallions exhaling raw fire, securing him at least a solitary mark for terrifying grandeur. Aphrodite reigned as the sovereign of passion, allure, obsession, and romantic catastrophes that left staggering body counts in their wake. If you have ever witnessed a mortal surrender their sanity to the absolute wrong soul, you have looked upon the crushing weight of Aphrodite's divine hand. Her genesis offers two traditions, depending on how much cosmic horror your psyche can endure. In one tale, she breathes as the daughter of Zeus and Dione. In the older, far more unsettling myth, she crystallized from the crimson seafoam birthed when Cronus severed Uranus's celestial anatomy and cast it into the dark waves. And yes, that is arguably the most unholy origin story ever anchored to the mistress of devotion. Aphrodite possessed a majesty so devastating that both gods and men forfeited their capacity for reason the moment she drew near. She owned a sacred girdle, the cestus, which rendered her utterly irresistible to any creature, an admittedly merciless weapon to wield in the territories of the heart. Despite being the physical manifestation of desire, her personal life was a fractured maze. She was bound to Hephaestus, the crippled god of industry and the forge. Yet, she notoriously craved the violent embrace of Ares, the lord of war, illuminating everything one needs to comprehend regarding her predatory taste in companions. Their secret passion was laid bare when Hephaestus ensnared them mid-embrace within a web of gold, summoning the celestial court to gaze upon their shame. Ancient Greece, where ruthless vengeance and public degradation were considered peak methods of divine justice. Yet Aphrodite was not entirely composed of malice and infidelity. She possessed a gentler current. She protected young lovers, blessed marital chambers, and infused a dying world with ethereal beauty. She was the entity mortals whispered to before baring their souls or attempting to charm their way out of a hanging offense. Still, she was perfectly willing to incinerate empires for her vanity. It was her hand that bartered Helen of Troy to Paris, igniting the catastrophic Trojan War. The reason? She merely wished to win a trivial beauty pageant against her sisters. Indeed, an entire civilization was reduced to ash because Aphrodite demanded a golden apple inscribed to the fairest. She is the patroness of hunger, not peace. Exquisite, intoxicating, and completely indifferent to your mortal boundaries. Hephaestus was the lord of embers, metallurgy, intricate craft, and the solitary entity on Mount Olympus who actually understood the meaning of labor. While the rest of the pantheon occupied themselves instigating massacres, defiling mortals, or scattering lightning like cheap festival confetti, Hephaestus was buried in the dark earth, hammering out weapons, raising iron palaces, and cursing bitterly under his breath. His origins are fractured, but none offer comfort. One myth claims he was born deformed, and Hera, utterly disgusted by his broken form, cast him off the celestial peak like an unwanted piece of garbage. Another states Zeus hurled him down after a domestic dispute. Regardless of the hand that broke him, the smith plummeted through the skies, struck the earth, and walked away with a shattered leg and abandonment issues deeper than the oceans. Despite that horrific beginning, Hephaestus reclaimed his high place not through begging, but through sheer leverage. He fashioned Hera an exquisite, mechanical golden throne that instantly chained her the moment she sat. The gods wept, pleading for her release. He relented, but only on the condition that they restore his seat within their elite circle. A masterclass in political extortion. Back within the heavens, Hephaestus became the ultimate divine engineer. He forged Zeus's devastating thunderbolts, Poseidon's continent-shattering trident, the immortal armor of Achilles, and every legendary relic the gods boasted about. If an artifact glowed, soared, or detonated, Hephaestus likely constructed it during endless nights of uncompensated overtime. Yet, despite his genius, he was treated with perpetual scorn. His unfaithful wife, Aphrodite, assigned to his bed rather than chosen, routinely betrayed him with Ares. His divine family remained cold and distant at best. His chaotic peers constantly broke the very structures he had spent centuries perfecting. But Hephaestus never erupted in mindless tantrums like Ares or plotted like Hera. His vengeance was calculated, elegant, beautifully passive-aggressive. Even that legendary net used to trap his wife mid-adultery was an artisan masterpiece designed for maximum public humiliation. Practical, poetic, and cruel, he possesses no glamour. He does not radiate light, but he is the deity who physically constructed Olympus. Hephaestus is the forgotten titan of industry, the blue-collar savior of the gods, the guardian of blacksmiths, creators, and anyone who has ever screamed at a broken machine before fixing it with raw hatred. Hermes is the god of wanderers, coin, cut purses, heralds, and remarkably silver-tongued lies. He is the figure adorned in winged sandals, holding a staff that definitely lacked an instruction manual, radiating an energy that suggests he has already stolen your gold and fabricated 3 alibis before sunrise. Unlike his sluggish siblings, Hermes hit the ground sprinting. On the very afternoon of his birth, he slipped from his swaddling clothes, plundered Apollo's sacred cattle, invented the lyre using a hollow tortoise shell, and slid back into his cradle before the sun could set. That was his first day. Most deities require centuries to orchestrate that brand of cosmic chaos. Hermes accomplished it in mere hours. He is sanitized in tales as the mere herald of the gods, but that diminishes his dark utility. He didn't just carry letters. He ferried screaming souls down into the underworld, guided desperate heroes through enemy trenches, and effectively pioneered the ancient concept of midnight smuggling. If a crisis emerged, Hermes was already 3 leagues ahead of the fallout, leaving behind a beautifully ambiguous alibi and a charming, predatory smile. He naturally oversaw the chaotic markets, because nothing screams pure financial integrity quite like a deity who also serves as the absolute patron of thieves. Hermes embodied the art of ruthless diplomacy, absolute persuasion, and a morally fluid genius for enterprise. In essence, he stood as the shadow patron of silver-tongued brokers, drifting exiles, clever cut purses, and anyone who has ever bartered for survival in a treacherous market. Yet, he was far more than a charismatic phantom. When the cosmic scales demanded it, his loyalty was absolute. He granted Odysseus the hidden salvation to outwit Circe's venomous drafts. He armed Perseus with the precise, lethal tools required to sever Medusa's crown. Most hauntingly, he ferried departing souls down into the gray twilight of the underworld with an unexpected, breathtaking gentleness, proving that beneath his chaotic mockery lay a somber duty he held sacred. Hermes moved through the night holding his legendary emblem, the caduceus, a winged scepter entwined by 2 perpetual serpents. It remains a historic irony that humanity constantly mistakes his staff for the crest of healing, considering his primary talents were blinding velocity, masterful deceit, and crossing forbidden boundaries without a trace. If the heavens possessed a hidden grid of intelligence, Hermes would operate as the feral, over-caffeinated operative speaking in cryptic codes, rewriting your entire reality in 2 minutes, and evaporating back into the ether to recalibrate reality, an act that may or may not involve lifting the Sky King's vault. He is brilliant, fleeting, dangerously unfaithful, yet fiercely captivating, the lord of executing the impossible, escaping the fallout, and ignoring any inquest. Demeter governs the fragile harvest, the cycle of agriculture, the turning of soil, and breathing life into a cold world, assuming her spirit has not been rotted by sorrow. When her grace shines, fields yield abundance, ancient boughs sag with fruit, and the earth drapes itself in gold. When malice or grief grips her heart, the world is introduced to the horror of winter, merciless famine, and a sweeping, withered decay. She bided her time as one of the quieter forces on Olympus. She unleashed no thunderbolts, ignited no mortal conflicts, and refrained from twisting flesh into beasts. Yet, do not confuse her stillness with weakness. She possessed the horrific authority to choke the planet's life supply with a single wave of depression, a weapon she unhesitatingly deployed when pushed into the dark. Enter Persephone, her adored daughter, the pristine, fragile flower child of the divine court. On a faithful day, as the maiden gathered blossoms, entirely blind to the lurking shadows, the earth split open like a fresh wound. Hades, the lord of the grave and a master of absolute abduction, surged from the black abyss and dragged her into his silent tomb. A classic crisis of divine lineage. Demeter, shattered by betrayal, surrendered her mind to pure grief. She roamed the dying world clad in mourning rags, forbidding a single seed from breaking through the dirt until her stolen child was returned. Crops decayed in the furrows. Starvation claimed the herds. Humanity wept before the altars. Demeter's response remained cold and absolute. No Persephone, no life. Eventually, Zeus was forced to breach the silence, primarily because humanity was turning to dust and the altars were starved of blood. A grim treaty was signed in the dark. Persephone would dwell within the tomb for a fraction of the year, returning to Demeter for the remainder. Thus, the cyclical seasons were forged in agony. Spring and summer marked Demeter's joy. Autumn and winter track her freezing spite. Indeed, the most crucial cycle of human survival hinges entirely upon a goddess's seasonal trauma. The agriculture of our world is sustained by maternal ruin and emotional blackmail. Mythology in its truest, darkest form. Demeter possessed an unyielding, terrifying sense of justice. She once gifted mortals the secrets of grain to erect great walls, yet subsequently immolated a royal heir in sacred fire because the terrified parents disrupted her secret ritual. A razor-thin boundary separates the giver of life from the ancient witch of the earth. At her core, she remains the emblem of fierce preservation, survival, and the bloody bond between mother and child. She coaxes life from the clay and tears it away with equal indifference. Dionysus reigns as the lord of the vine. Midnight revelry, carnal ecstasy, theatrical madness, and those catastrophic choices you commit to after the third glass of whatever poison he pours. He is the living manifestation of wild abandonment wrapped in creeping ivy, permanently intoxicated and flanked by hunting leopards. Born under a shroud of cosmic violence, his life began as the bastard spawn of Zeus and a doomed mortal queen named Semele. When Hera discovered the insult, because her vengeance never slept, she deceived Semele into demanding Zeus unveil his true, unshielded majesty. The sheer radiance vaporized her mortal flesh instantly. Zeus, ever the ruthless tactician, cut his unborn son from the ash, stitched Dionysus into his own thigh, and carried the boy until he broke free. A womb of divine flesh. The ancient world, where nothing is too grotesque to worship. Dionysus grew up as a wandering exile, scattering blood-red wine, chaotic ecstasy, and a profound existential dread across the earth. He moved with a violent caravan of feral satyrs, blood-crazed maenads, and woodland predators, a traveling circus of madness and property damage. His worship was not a matter of festive joy. Dionysian rites demanded the systematic shattering of your identity, your morals, and occasionally your garments. His gatherings were primal, nocturnal storms of masks, dark theater, and unholy acts beneath a blind sky. Picture a gathering of pure hedonism, but with catastrophic cosmic consequences. Yet, Dionysus was not merely a god of intoxication. He harbored a volatile temper, deeply theatrical in its execution. If you dared mock his lineage, reject his chalice, or break his trance, reality dissolved. A king who outlawed his cult was driven into a feral insanity and dismembered by his own screaming subjects. Another fleet of hunters was transformed into dolphins mid-sea. He favored grand, symbolic damnation. Yet he offered an intense compassion to the discarded, the broken, and those cast out by polite society. He brought comfort to the fractured, gave a voice to the muted, and occasionally shifted the dying into emerald vines, a dark symbol of rebirth through ruin. Dionysus is the raw paradox of liberation and collapse. He is ecstasy in ruin, art in dementia, the god who crowns your mind with pure creativity 1 second, and leaves you dancing barefoot in a blood-soaked vineyard the next, questioning your sanity. Artemis is the mistress of the hunt, the untamed wilderness, predatory beasts, and the cold light of the moon. She is also the sovereign of silence, an absolute refusal to justify her actions, and a living promise of violence. Seldom seen without a silver bow in her hand and an absolute lack of mercy in her eyes, Artemis stands as one of the rare Olympians who required neither thunderbolts nor deceptive enchantments. She commanded absolute precision, icy discipline, and a legion of monstrous white wolves. Born as the twin sister to Apollo, Artemis entered the world with an overachieving savagery. She aided in the delivery of her own brother moments after breaking from her mother's womb. From that dawn forward, she was finished with the world of men. She forswore all marriage, all romance, and anything resembling the vulnerability of love. Instead, she claimed the black forests, hunted royal stags, and surrounded herself with a fanatical sisterhood of maidens who shared her devotion to the wild and her utter hatred for drama. Artemis is remembered for her fierce purity, not in a fragile manner, but in a lethal, "do not touch me or I will turn you into prey" fashion. Look at Actaeon, a hunter who blundered into her sacred stream while she bathed. Rather than offer warning, she twisted his human flesh into a stag and watched in silence as his own hunting hounds tore him to ribbons. The lesson was painted in blood. She stood as a ruthless guardian, particularly for women and young children. While her siblings treated mortals like expendable pieces on a board, Artemis acted as a shield for the helpless. She broke anyone who desecrated the wild or harmed the innocent. Her retribution was swift, poetic, and inevitably fatal. As the moon goddess, she embodied cold clarity and ancient mystery. She cast a pale light upon the pathless night, guiding travelers through the dark, both literally and spiritually. If Apollo represented the sun's blinding, arrogant heat, Artemis was the moon's frozen, unblinking gaze. Less comfort, more surveillance. She possessed no need for theatrical displays. Her presence alone was absolute. You did not defy her. You did not admire her. You simply prayed her silver arrows were pointed elsewhere. In modern terms, she is the ultimate independent force. Shadowed, untamed, and completely indifferent to your judgment. She rejected Olympus. She ruled the dark woods. Apollo reigns as the Lord of the Sun. Music, prophecy, medicine, poetry, archery, and honestly, at this juncture, it is safer to assume he claimed every vacant seat on the celestial high council. If the pantheon possessed a registry of expertise, Apollo's credentials would shatter the system. The twin to Artemis, he shines as the radiant, golden poster child of Olympus. Gilded hair, a golden lyre, a golden chariot. He is the architect of daylight, steering the sun across the burning vault every morning in a chariot of raw flame. A crushing weight to carry every dawn. Yet beneath that blinding exterior lies a well of unstable emotion. Apollo is intensely dramatic, volatile, the type of entity who composes weeping ballads after a betrayal and subsequently places an immortal curse upon the soul that spurned him. Look at Daphne. She chose to harden into a mindless laurel tree just to escape his persistent advance. Apollo wept over her bark, transformed her leaves into his sacred icon, and wore her remains as a crown, because that is how a god processes rejection. He is also the patron of prophecy, meaning he possesses the unique agony of knowing exactly how tragically things will end. yet rages when the collapse occurs. Classic overachiever torment. He established the Oracle of Delphi, where priestesses choked on volcanic vapors to mutter poetic riddles that dictated the destiny of kings. A deeply unsettling system. Apollo maintained a catastrophic relationship with desire. He pursued countless mortals, was rejected by the majority, and responded with varying degrees of poetic slaughter. When a Spartan prince named Hyacinthus perished during a game of discus, struck down by a stray throw from Apollo's own hand, the god was so broken by grief he transformed the boy's blood into a blooming flower, a sentimental gesture if you overlook the blunt force trauma that caused it. Yet, he remained a healer. His son Asclepius became the god of medicine, and Apollo himself could cure plagues or cause them depending on how offended he felt that day. In short, Apollo was brilliance wrapped in insecurity, power dressed in poetry, and charm with a short fuse. The kind of god who'd write you a love song and then shoot you with an arrow if you didn't clap. Hestia is the goddess of the hearth, home, and domestic peace, which is ancient Greek for the only Olympian who didn't cause weekly international incidents. She was the eldest child of Crones and Rhea, and also the first to be swallowed whole by her charmingly paranoid father. Later she was the last to be vomited back up when Zeus overthrew him, which means technically she's both the oldest and youngest Olympian. Yes, Greek mythology is a funhouse mirror of logic. Unlike her more chaotic siblings, Hestia chose peace. She didn't participate in power struggles, didn't throw curses, didn't sleep with mortals, and didn't even throw shade. She was offered a throne on Olympus, shrugged politely, and gave it up to Dionysus. Why? So she could tend the eternal flame and not get dragged into family drama. Queen behavior. She presided over the hearth, the center of every home, temple, and city. Wherever there was a flame burning for warmth, food, or ritual, Hestia was there in spirit. No temples in her name, no scandalous myths, just a quiet presence that made everything else work. The original background essential. She was also the goddess of hospitality. In a world where shelter and food meant survival, she represented the sacred duty of caring for guests. Invoking her meant your fire would stay lit, your bread wouldn't burn, and hopefully your relatives would leave on time. And unlike most Olympians, she didn't go around turning people into animals, inanimate objects, or ironic morality lessons. Hestia didn't need revenge. She had a well-swept floor and inner peace. Because of her, every meal began and ended with an offering. Every city had her flame burning in its heart, and every prayer circle probably had someone whispering, "Thank you for not being a handful." If the gods were a dysfunctional office, Zeus would be the CEO with boundary issues, Athena the overqualified strategist, Dionysus the HR violation, and Hestia would be the calm office manager keeping the coffee warm and the lights on while everyone else argued about whose temple caught fire. Hestia reminds us that there's power in stillness, value in simplicity, and sometimes the most essential figure is the one who doesn't demand attention but holds everything together. Perseus is one of the most fascinating figures in Greek mythology, a goddess with a split personality written directly into the seasons. She's the bloom of spring and the chill of death, life and decay, flower crown and iron throne. She's the daughter of Dita, goddess of the harvest, which already puts her in the realm of life and fertility. But then things took a turn, as they often do in Greek myth, when Hades, lord of the underworld, saw her picking flowers and decided, wife material. He abducted her straight into the underworld. No discussion, no coffee first. Dita naturally was devastated. She scoured the earth, and when no one told her where Persephone had gone, she shut down agriculture entirely. The result, global famine and an angry mob of hungry mortals. Eventually Zeus intervened, not out of fatherly concern, but because no one was sacrificing anything while starving. A compromise was reached. Persephone could return if she hadn't eaten anything in the underworld, which of course she had. 6 pomegranate seeds, just enough to legally bind her to a part-time gig in the land of the dead. Thus began her dual role. Half the year on Earth with Dido, ushering in spring and summer, the other half with Hades in the underworld, giving us fall and winter. The ancient Greeks invented seasonal depression with a myth. But here's where things get interesting. Over time, Perseus embraced her role as Queen of the Dead. She wasn't just a sad, kidnapped flower girl. She became a ruler, calm, firm, and quietly powerful. Mortals prayed to her for mercy, for safe passage, for understanding the balance between life and death. She represents transformation, not just seasonal, but emotional. The shift from innocence to strength, from being taken to taking control. Perseus is the goddess of duality. She walks through flowers and bones with equal grace. She's the reason flowers bloom, and the reason they wilt. Before Psyche was even old enough to understand the word goddess, she was being compared to one. By the time she reached womanhood, statues of Aphrodite were gathering dust while mortals traveled miles just to glimpse the face of this mortal girl. Her beauty wasn't simply admired, it was worshipped. Entire crowds treated her as if she were Aphrodite, reincarnated in flesh and bone. People whispered that she must be divine, that no mortal woman could look like this by accident. But for Psyche, all the reverence felt hollow. She walked through cities and villages like a phantom, adored but untouched, celebrated but alone. No one dared to approach her with true affection. Men looked at her like a living painting, flawless, silent, untouchable. Even her family, though proud, grew uneasy. Her 2 sisters had married noble men, begun families, and lived the kind of grounded, warm lives that Psyche herself craved. But no suitor would dare to court a girl believed to be a rival of Aphrodite, and therein lay the danger. You see, the gods weren't fond of competition, especially Aphrodite. Watching her temples grow silent while mortals laid garlands at the feet of a mere girl made the goddess burn with divine rage. To her, Psyche wasn't a beautiful child, she was an insult carved into flesh. Yet Psyche knew none of this. She spent her days walking gardens alone, speaking to no one. She'd never felt a lover's touch or heard a whispered vow in the dark. Her beauty had become a curse, one that distanced her from the only thing she truly wanted, a soul that saw her, not just her face. She would stand by her window at dusk, watching the horizon fade and thinking perhaps this was her fate, to be loved by all but held by none. No priest, no oracle, no stranger ever offered an answer, until one day someone did. But it wasn't a man, it wasn't a priest, and it wasn't a mortal. It was a goddess. And she wasn't offering love, she was demanding revenge. On Mount Olympus, beauty was more than vanity, it was power. And no one wielded it like Aphrodite. She was the goddess of desire, of seduction, of divine charm. But lately, her temples echoed with emptiness. Her statue stood lonely beneath the sun. Why? Because mortals now knelt before a human girl, Psyche, as if she were the new goddess of love. To Aphrodite, this wasn't just offensive, it was treason. The goddess watched from her celestial perch, her envy twisting into hatred. She had destroyed kings for less. How dare a mortal girl steal her worshippers? How dare she exist as a living insult to divine beauty? And so, Aphrodite did what goddesses do. She summoned her son, Eros. Now Eros wasn't just any deity. He was the god of love, yes, but not the soft, tender love mortals wrote poems about. No, Eros dealt in chaos. He sparked passion where there should be none. He made kings fall for swindlers, queens for slaves, enemies for each other. His arrows didn't ask for permission. They shattered logic, loyalty, and sometimes entire empires. Aphrodite's command was simple: make Psyche fall in love with the most hideous, vile creature on earth. Something monstrous, something beneath even the worms. Let her feel what it's like to be mocked by love. Eros, ever the obedient son, accepted, bow slung over his back, quiver full of divine arrows. He descended to the mortal realm under the cover of moonlight. He found Psyche asleep in her chamber, candlelight flickering across her features like water. She was beautiful, too beautiful, and Eros, who had pierced 1,000 hearts, felt his own skip a beat. This wasn't right. This wasn't part of the plan. Still, he reached for his arrow. But in his distraction, something went wrong. His hand slipped. The arrow pricked his skin. Just a drop, but it was enough. The god of love had just fallen victim to his own power. And in that moment, fate shifted. For Eros would no longer be his mother's weapon. He would be Psyche's silent protector. But neither of them knew what price the gods would demand for this forbidden affection. And Aphrodite would not forgive betrayal. Eros vanished before Psyche could stir from her sleep, the wound from his own arrow still burning like an open flame upon his chest. He had pierced countless mortal hearts across the epics, but never once had his own immortal soul fallen prey to his chaotic game. Now, with every shattering beat of his heart, he felt an ancient, terrifying longing, a desperate need to protect her from the cruel, voyeuristic eyes of Mount Olympus. But divine preservation always demanded a pound of flesh. He could never dare reveal his true name. If Aphrodite discovered his betrayal, there would be no mercy. Not for him, and certainly not for the mortal girl. So Eros made a silent, bleeding vow. He would love her exclusively from the deepest shadows. Meanwhile, Psyche's mortal existence grew colder by the day. No suitors breached her father's gates. Her legendary beauty, once a grand spectacle, now felt like a rotten curse. When her desperate father consulted the dark oracle of Apollo, the words that returned were etched in pure dread. She shall wed no mortal man, but a monstrous beast feared even by the gods. Leave her upon the jagged peak, dressed as a pristine bride. Her family wept, but Psyche stood entirely paralyzed, as if the bitter wind had carved her into stone. A monster. This was her grand destiny. Still, she climbed the mountain, not out of courage, but out of absolute resignation. Eros watched her ascent from his celestial perch, his heart twisting with an agony he had never inflicted on others. He had meant to shield her, but the fates had spun a web too thick to untangle. If he intervened openly, his mother's wrath would incinerate the kingdom. So he devised a desperate, hidden gamble. He would carry her away to a secret sanctuary known only to him, a palace cloaked in illusions and absolute silence. He would love her not as an arrogant god, but as a phantom. He would never unveil his face, never utter his title, and above all, never grant her the truth. For he knew that if she ever looked upon his divine form, their paradise would instantly shatter. Even the Lord of Desire was terrified of a broken heart. The wind was predatory yet strange as it lifted Psyche from the freezing mountain peak. She had braced herself for gnashing teeth and a beast's roar, but instead, she was met with a heavy, surreal stillness. When she finally opened her eyes, the rocky precipice was gone. She stood within a vast meadow of glowing, bioluminescent flowers that bled light into the twilight. A path of polished obsidian wound through the fields, leading her toward an impossible monolith, a palace grander than any structure raised by human hands. Its colossal pillars shimmered like pale moonlight on black water, and its endless corridors whispered her name without a single sound. Psyche crossed the threshold, expecting horror, but finding an unsettling peace. Unseen hands guided her movements, washed the mountain dust from her feet, and draped her shoulders in heavy, seamless silk. Food appeared before her, warm and fragrant, though no servants cast shadows in the halls. When night finally blanketed the valley, a voice, deep, velvety, and laced with an ancient warmth, echoed from the velvet dark of her bedchamber. Do not tremble. You are safe. This is your kingdom now. It was her unseen master, the entity the oracle had promised. Yet there was no clawed beast in the dark, only a voice that wrapped around her like a dream. He joined her only when the world was blind, touching her face with a reverence that made her chest ache. He whispered laughter into her ear, but every morning, Long before the sun could bleed through the silk curtains, he was gone. She was falling into an abyss of love without a face, an intimacy born entirely of darkness. Yet his solitary command remained absolute. Never attempt to look upon me. When she asked him why, the shadow tensed. If you see my form, I must leave you to the winds forever. For a time she obeyed. But the human heart is a fragile, curious thing, and the seeds of doubt, once planted in the dark, never remain buried for long. Weeks bled into months within the invisible sanctuary, where time itself seemed to lose its meaning. Psyche knew luxury and a phantom's embrace, but she also knew an absolute, suffocating isolation. Then, one morning, her husband's voice held a jagged edge of sorrow. Ruin follows your footsteps, Psyche. Your sisters approach the gates. They weep for you, but they bring an ancient poison. Her heart cracked at the mention of her blood. She missed their laughter, their warmth, even their bitter rivalries. They were her last anchor to the mortal world. She begged and pleaded until Eros, incapable of denying her desires, relented with a grim warning. Do not let their words unravel what we have built in the dark. When the sisters were delivered to the palace gates by the wind, they were instantly paralyzed by envy. Psyche was not dead. She was radiant, draped in fabrics finer than any empress, her skin glowing with a celestial light. They embraced her with brittle smiles, their eyes darting across the impossible wealth of the halls. Where is the master of this house? The eldest whispered over wine. Psyche offered a fragile smile. He comes only when the sun dies. I have never looked upon his face. The sisters froze, their concern turning into something sharp and venomous. You have never seen him? The other gasped, her voice dripping with artificial terror. What if he is a grotesque abomination, fattening you up for a slaughter? Or worse, a god amusing himself with a blind mortal plaything? They left her that evening, but the poison had already entered her veins. They pressed a bronze lamp and a sharp blade into her trembling hands, whispering, "Unveil him tonight. If he truly loves you, what harm can the light do?" That night, Psyche could not escape the screaming in her mind. Beside her, her husband slept, his breathing steady, his arm draped possessively over her waist. Her sister's words repeated like an unholy incantation in her ears. Had she surrendered her sanity to a monster? She slipped from the silk sheets, silent as a falling leaf, her bare feet pressing against the freezing stone. In her trembling hand, she raised the bronze lamp, its small flame dancing wildly against the shadows. She leaned over the bed, her breath catching in her throat as the golden light finally washed over the mattress. There was no beast, no monstrous scales. Sleeping before her was Eros himself, the breathtaking god of desire. Golden curls lay tangled upon the pillow, and from his shoulders grew magnificent, feathered wings, folded like a sacred secret. Her eyes overflowed with tears of profound guilt. He had loved her, protected her, and she had brought fire into his dark haven. Wanting to press her lips to his before extinguishing the light, she leaned closer. But fate is an unmerciful entity. A single, scalding drop of oil spilled from the lip of the lamp, falling directly onto his bare, immortal shoulder. Eros awoke with a sharp cry of physical pain and spiritual betrayal. His vast wings flared, shattering the heavy silence of the chamber, his eyes wide with an absolute heartbreak that dimmed his divine luminescence. "You broke the promise," he said, his voice hollow, sounding like a dying wind. "You trusted their fear more than my love." Psyche fell to her knees, reaching for his robes through her tears. "I am sorry. I only wanted to know." Eros stepped back into the shadows, his form dissolving into smoke. "Now you do." With those final words, the magnificent palace began to rot and crumble around her, the illusion evaporating into the cold night air. The invisible world they had shared vanished like mist over a graveyard. When the dawn finally broke, Psyche found herself entirely alone on a barren, jagged hillside, the bronze lamp still warm in her hand and her soul utterly shattered. She had looked upon the face of love, and lost him entirely to her own doubt. She wandered barefoot across a world that now seemed infinitely colder and more merciless. The lush gardens and the voice that had once anchored her reality were gone. She screamed his name into the valleys, into the rushing rivers, and into the silent forests, but the universe offered no reply. In her absolute desperation, she dragged her broken body back to her father's kingdom, but the high walls that had once sheltered her childhood now only whispered with the dark rumors of her ruin. The vicious laughter of her own blood echoed through the abandoned halls of her childhood home. Her sisters took a sickening pleasure in her downfall, whispering malicious rumors to ensure the kingdom viewed her story as the delusions of a fractured mind. To the world, there was no winged god, no invisible paradise, only a disgraced woman weaving manic fables. Cast out by doubt, Psyche did not weep. A cold, unyielding clarity took root within her. She would track her lost lover through the shifting fabric of reality, across oceans of stars, or directly into the roaring furnace of Mount Olympus if required. Yet, the high heavens do not open their gates for the prayers of dying mortals. She needed a map through the cosmic void, and only one entity held the keys, the architect of her current torment. Aphrodite. The goddess was a force of absolute malice, harboring a divine hatred for the girl who had inadvertently stolen her altars. But Psyche was no longer a fragile princess. If there was even a microscopic chance to mend the bond she had severed, she would willingly throw herself into the jaws of a celestial executioner. She discovered the High Queen of Desire resting within a cavernous sanctuary constructed entirely of fractured mirrors, obsessively hunting for imperfections that the cosmos could never manifest. When Psyche approached, the goddess did not grant her a glance. "I warned you about the price of touching what is mine," Aphrodite purred, her voice carrying the chilling finality of an iron tomb. Psyche dropped to the stone floor, her voice a low, steady vow. "I will bleed to reclaim him." A dry, mocking chuckle rattled against the glass. "You wish to salvage the trust of the very deity you blinded with your betrayal?" "I was drowning in fear," Psyche whispered, "but I will survive any horror to prove my devotion." Aphrodite finally faced her, her gaze burning with an ancient, sadistic fire. "Any horror? Then let us see how much agony your mortal shell can endure before it turns to ash." The trials were not designed to test her stamina. They were engineered to break her soul. The initial punishment appeared deceptively mundane. Aphrodite dragged her into a vast, subterranean vault where massive dunes of grain, barley, wheat, lentils, poppy seeds, and beans had been violently agitated until they formed a chaotic, inseparable mass. By the time the sun dies, Aphrodite murmured, her eyes vacant with boredom, "You will categorize this entire wasteland into flawless, separate mounds. Fail, and my son will remain an eternal ghost to you." With a soft, cruel hum, she dissolved into the dark. Psyche stared at the impossible continent of dust. A million hands working across centuries could not have brought structure to this ruin in a single day. Yet she fell to her knees and began, her fingers splitting against the rough hulls, her vision swimming in the dim light. The hours dissolved, and she had not even conquered a handful. But the old forces of the earth are always breathing in the dark. From the deep fissures in the masonry, a colossal colony of ants, the sacred vanguards of Demeter, the ancient sovereign of the harvest, observed her silent desperation. Moved by the raw, kinetic energy of her love, the insects descended in terrifying, synchronized waves. They formed living, black rivers across the floor, manipulating each seed with mathematical, alien precision. Within moments, the chaos was tamed. Neat pyramids of barley and perfect walls of lentils rose from the stone. When Aphrodite returned at twilight, expecting a weeping corpse, she found absolute symmetry, her face contorted with divine fury. "You did not accomplish this alone," she hissed. Psyche kept her gaze fixed on the earth. "My hands merely followed the rhythm of the dark." The goddess's jaw clenched in a volatile mixture of rage and twisted fascination. The mortal girl had not only survived the vault, she had done so with a terrifying serenity. But the road ahead was carpeted in daggers. "This was merely a scratch," the queen whispered. "If you intend to hunt Eros, luck will not save you from what comes next." Exhausted and bleeding, Psyche simply nodded. True devotion was a currency more valuable than the fragile vanity of Olympus, and her war against the gods had only just begun. There was no reprieve before Aphrodite delivered the second command, a hunt meticulously designed to tear her flesh from bone. "Look down at the black ribbon of water cutting through the canyon," the goddess whispered, pointing to a jagged stream that glinted like a razor blade under the harsh sun. "Beyond its banks lies a meadow where wild, untamed rams roam. Their fleece is spun from predatory gold. Bring me a single lock of that metal, but do try to return with your life." With a venomous smirk, she evaporated, leaving Psyche to face certain death. These were no ordinary beasts. The golden rams were bloodthirsty monsters sacred to the old powers, possessing eyes full of crimson madness and horns capable of crushing iron armor. They slaughtered anything that breached their territory, trampling intruders into the dirt without hesitation. They shone like cosmic treasure, but they guarded that treasure with pure malice. Psyche descended the treacherous slope, crouching low within the sharp reeds as her heart hammered against her ribs. The monsters paced the perimeter, their massive hooves splintering the boulders beneath them, their low growls rolling across the valley like static electricity. To step into that field under the daylight meant instant obliteration. She sank into the mud, tears of sheer exhaustion threatening to break her resolve. But the universe was still listening. A low, rhythmic melody drifted through the tall grass, a vibrating voice like reeds swaying in perfect unison. It was the ancient spirit of the river, bound to the flowing current. "Do not challenge the meadow while the sun rules the sky," the spirit vibrated softly. "The golden beasts burn with fury under the heat of day. Wait until the darkness forces them into the deep shade to sleep. Only then may you safely gather the strands of golden wool that have snagged upon the thorns and briars along the perimeter. The monsters will never know it is gone." Hope flooded her veins once more. Psyche waited in the freezing mud for hours until the golden nightmares finally retreated into the thickets, surrendering to a heavy slumber. As midnight blanketed the valley, she crept forward like a phantom, carefully harvesting the glowing threads of gold tangled in the briars. Under the pale moonlight, she returned to Aphrodite, presenting the radiant handful. The goddess narrowed her eyes, her frustration turning into genuine alarm. "You breathe still," she muttered, her curiosity turning toxic. Psyche offered no response, no arrogance, no satisfaction. Only a quiet, terrifying resilience. Love had given her a weapon the Olympians had long forgotten. True courage does not scream. It endures in absolute silence. And though Aphrodite's cruelty was infinite, Psyche's capacity to survive was greater. The goddess's frustration had matured into a dangerous obsession. The mortal girl was walking through execution chambers using nothing but raw will and an infuriating, unearthly protection. The artificial smile was completely gone from Aphrodite's face, replaced by a cold, homicidal calculation. For the third trial, she constructed an errand meant to erase Psyche's name from history. "Bring me water," she commanded, casting a crystal vial into the dust. Not from a mountain spring, not from a running river, but from the freezing source of the river Styx itself. Psyche's blood turned to ice. The Styx was the absolute, unholy boundary between the living and the dead, a current of black, toxic fluid that was instantly fatal to any mortal touch. Even the high gods approached its shores with trembling dread. Yet, Psyche claimed the glass and turned toward the mountains. Her path led her to the edge of a precipice, so sheer and violent it looked as though the world had been cracked open by the axes of titans. Far below, the Styx churned like boiling obsidian, emitting suffocating vapors and the agonizing shrieks of trapped souls. The water did not flow, it thrashed like a caged predator. Worse still, guarding the jagged cliffs were prehistoric, winged abominations, ancient sentinels of the underworld that tore through the fog, attacking anything that moved with talons sharp enough to strip flesh from bone. There was no path down, no strategy, no hope. She collapsed beneath a jagged rock ledge, clutching the glass. Just a sip, Aphrodite had mocked. Enough to prove you died trying. Suddenly, a colossal shadow broke the ash-gray sky. A majestic eagle of monstrous proportions descended from the thunderclouds, its eyes burning like molten gold. It was the personal vanguard of Zeus himself. Without a single sound, the great bird tore the crystal vial from Psyche's fingers, spread its massive wings, and dove straight into the jaws of the abyss. The winged monsters shrieked in fury, but they dared not strike. Even the denizens of death feared the absolute wrath of the Sky King. Within moments, the eagle re-emerged from the toxic mist, dropping the sealed vial, now filled with the shimmering, cursed fluid of the Styx, safely into Psyche's lap. She did not ask why the king of Olympus had intervened. Perhaps even the highest gods were forced to respect a love that refused to die. When Psyche presented the black water, Aphrodite accepted it in stony, terrifying silence. Psyche had rewritten the odds once more, but the final task would drag her into a darkness from which no soul returns intact. The goddess's voice dropped to a register colder than the grave. "For your ultimate punishment," she whispered, her gaze boring into the girl's soul, "you will descend into the absolute roots of the underworld. There, you will approach Queen Persephone and demand a small box of her divine beauty. A gift for me, as your pathetic survival has left my own features feeling quite exhausted." It was a direct command to die. Even the most arrogant heroes avoided the iron kingdom of Hades. The living did not cross that threshold and expect to breathe again. But Psyche did not hesitate. If the road back to Eros required her to walk through the land of the dead, then death would simply have to get out of her way. Guided by cryptic whispers from sympathetic forces, some claim it was the grieving Demeter, others whisper it was invisible demons of kindness operating in the dark. She discovered a forgotten fissure in the earth, a deep, jagged cavern that pierced the world's surface like an unhealed scar, bleeding a cold, silent dark into the mortal realm. With the empty box clutched to her chest, Psyche stepped into the abyss. Within her tightening grip, she carried 2 bronze coins intended for Charon, the silent ferryman of the abyss, and a pair of barley cakes to appease Cerberus, the multi-headed predator guarding the threshold. Each step descending into the deep ice of the underworld stripped the residual warmth from her mortal bones. The atmosphere here did not choke with smoke, it suffocated with an absolute, hollow silence. The pale phantoms she passed drifted by like evaporated memories, thin, translucent, and completely insulated from the living. At the edge of the obsidian waters, Charon claimed his cold currency. He rowed her across a stagnant river saturated with the sediment of forgotten grief. When the monstrous shape of Cerberus materialized at the gates of the obsidian palace, his jaws dripping with ancient gore, she tossed the honeyed cakes into his path. The beast grew quiet, the low thunder in his throat dissolving as he tore into the offering. Deep within the monochrome gloom sat Persephone, frozen upon a throne of polished glass, her eyes reflecting the cold light of buried gems. "You have braved the graveyard of gods to demand a fracture of my grace," the queen murmured, her voice carrying the heavy, ancient weight of winter. "Yet you do not understand the transaction." "I do not seek this light for my own vanity," Psyche replied, her voice steady despite the freezing fog. "I am merely the vessel delivering it to the Queen of Desire." Persephone's gaze softened, a flash of ancient recognition crossing her features. Perhaps even the high gods are helpless against the madness of devotion. She extended a small, unadorned box. It was entirely unmarked, yet it held an impossible, crushing weight. "Seal this away," the queen commanded. "If you unlock this container, you invite a dark that your mortal architecture cannot survive." Psyche, offering a silent bow, retreated into the dark. The return journey through the subterranean tunnels was quiet, but her mind grew increasingly loud under the pressure of a rising temptation. The relic pulsed against her palms like a trapped heart. "Surely, a single glance cannot undo my salvation," a treacherous whisper echoed in her thoughts. Over and over, she fought the urge, but the ancient poison of doubt, once allowed to breed, is a patient monster. What if this box held the absolute key to making her worthy of an immortal lord? What if this was the final wall between herself and redemption? The surface was only yards away. The pale light of the mortal world began to wash over her face for the first time in weeks. Her pulse raced, her fingers trembled, and unable to conquer the screaming curiosity within her soul, she lifted the lid. Darkness did not explode from the box. It poured out like a freezing sigh from a tomb. There was no divine radiance inside. No glowing cosmetic secret. It was a dense, weaponized slumber. A deathless paralysis woven by Persephone to preserve the static nature of her domain. Psyche did not scream. She did not stumble. The animation simply evaporated from her limbs. Her body collapsed softly onto the damp grass at the absolute boundary of the living world, the open box rolling into the dirt beside her. Her chest grew still. Her breath ceased. She was not dead, yet she no longer belonged to the living, caught in an eternal, frozen pause, a monument to her own curiosity. But true love is a volatile entity. It does not follow the decrees of the grave. High above, within the gold-veined halls of Olympus, Eros had broken through his exile. His physical wounds had closed, but his spirit remained fractured. Confined by his mother's iron commands, he had been tortured by visions of the mortal girl navigating execution chambers for his sake. The moment the whispers reached him that she had descended into the kingdom of the dead, something shifted within his immortal nature. To defy the pantheon, to walk through the land of ash, all for a phantom in the dark. That was no longer a fragile mortal princess. That was a sovereign. Defying Aphrodite's decrees, Eros erupted from his confinement in a blinding tempest of gold and feathered wings. He tore through the celestial spheres, the clouds shattering in his wake, until he descended upon the silent ridge where she lay motionless, looking like a marble statue kissed by the bleeding colors of twilight. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his chest heaving not with sorrow, but with a dangerous, ancient rage at the cruelty of the fates. He reached down, carefully gathering the toxic mist back into the box and slamming the lid shut. Then, without a single thought for divine law, he pressed his lips against hers. It was not a ritual of magic. It was a vow, a desperate plea, a memory of the dark. Psyche's chest heaved. The deathless fog dissolved from her blood, and before her eyes could even focus on the world, her hands reached for his face. "Eros," she whispered, her voice like a waking wind. "I never left you," he murmured, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it seemed to challenge the foundations of the mountain. And around them, the watchful eyes of the gods, some twisted in anger, others silent in awe, finally understood. The Lord of Desire had met in force equal to his own power. The shockwave of their reunion rattled the golden court. A god had broken his mother's chains. A mortal had rewritten the laws of the grave. Together, they had erased the border between the celestial and the dust. Such an alliance was an insult to the hierarchy. Aphrodite entered the grand hall like a storm of glass and fire, demanding absolute erasure. "This creature has made a mockery of our altars," the goddess screamed, her voice shaking the stone pillars. "She has corrupted my son, manipulated the currents of the Styx, and broken the sacred balance. She must be reduced to ash." But the assembly of the gods remained strangely quiet. They had watched the girl sift through mountains of ruin, face the blood-mad beasts of the valley, and return from the iron gates of Hades. Her devotion had outlasted the worst horrors the sky could invent. The dispute could only be settled by one throne. Zeus sat in absolute stillness, the lightning resting cold in his grip, his gaze fixed on the two entities standing before him. He had measured every step of her descent, from her initial doubt to this final, unyielding devotion. At last, his voice rolled across the assembly like low thunder. "There is a dangerous sovereignty in a love that refuses to break," the king stated. Aphrodite stepped forward to contest his words, but he raised a solitary, scarred hand, silencing the court. "You have broken her body, and yet her spirit stands. She has passed gauntlets that would destroy half the entities in this room. She is no longer an insult to Olympus. She is the proof that mortals can carry the fire of the gods." He turned his focus directly to Eros and Psyche. "Is it your collective will to bound your existences across eternity?" They nodded, their hands locked between them. "Then let the cosmic fabric reflect it." With a movement of his fingers, Zeus summoned a heavy vessel overflowing with amber ambrosia. He extended it toward the girl. "Drink and leave the parameters of death behind. Your soul will join the immortal collective. But do not expect your scars to vanish. You will bear them as a testament to the journey that forged you." Psyche accepted the vessel, her hands entirely steady. She drank the celestial fluid. A strange, deep warmth bloomed through her veins. Not a burning fire, but a slow expansion of her very essence. Her perception shattered its mortal limits. Her heart slowed, deepening into a rhythm that matched the turning of the centuries. The transition was absolute. She was no longer a creature of dust or a spectacle for the eyes of kings. Eros took her hand, and before the gathered pantheon, they were bound as equals. A story that began in the dark had been crowned in the light. The transformation altered her down to the cellular level. Her skin caught the light with a celestial luminescence, her eyes no longer holding tears, but the cold depth of stars. The entities who had once sneered at her mortal blood could only watch in silence. For the first time in the memory of the sky, a human had earned an immortal throne not through a divine bloodline, but through the sheer endurance of her will. She was no longer Psyche the victim, or Psyche the beautiful. She was Psyche the eternal, a deity in her own right. Even Aphrodite, her fury spent against an unyielding wall, could no longer dispute the entity standing before her. A woman who had survived isolation, execution chambers, and the complete weight of divine hatred. Eros stepped between his bride and his mother, his expression calm but absolute. "She was never a competitor for your altars, mother," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his new maturity. "She is the missing piece of the design, the soul that gives meaning to desire." In that moment, the ancient tension within the court finally dissolved. Zeus proclaimed her the sovereign of the human soul, Psyche, the breath of life itself. Her trials had not turned her into a flawless, empty monument, but into the living definition of what love must survive to become real. A massive celebration tore through the golden halls. Nectar flowed like mountain rivers, the constellations shifted in dance, and even the fates paused their spinning to acknowledge the narrative they had lost control of. Psyche stood beside her husband, no longer a stranger hiding in the shadows. She was an equal. Together, they looked down at the mortal realms below, the guardians of the precarious journey between desire and the spirit. From their eternal union, a daughter was born. Hedone, the goddess of raw joy and delight, the spirit born only when the soul and love become one. Where Psyche had once walked through thorns and black mud, she now moved in eternal light, not because she was free of flaws, but because she had fallen, bled, and dragged herself back from the abyss. She was the permanent reminder that the broken-hearted could storm the heavens, one trial at a time. And so their narrative did not dissolve into a tragedy of dust and graves, but into an eternal truth whispered across the centuries, from the ruins of ancient altars to the quiet corners of modern rooms. True love is never an easy grace. It is interrogated by doubt. It is wounded by pride. It is targeted by the dark. But when it survives the furnace, it ceases to be mortal. It becomes infinite. Even today, long after the great pillars have collapsed into dust and vast empires have been erased from history, the echo of their struggle endures. It lives on within the word psyche, which represents the core of the human spirit. It survives within psychology, the dedicated dissection of that very spirit. And in every modern tale where love is brought to its knees only to rise victorious, the names of Eros and his bride remain alive, not as static monuments carved from cold stone, but as a collective pulse residing within each of us. Every time a human being chooses vulnerability over terror, absolution over vanity, and communication over an empty silence, they tread that exact, ancient path. And perhaps, just like those two star-crossed entities, we allow ourselves to become a little more divine. Long before her name became a synonym for terror, before warriors froze mid-scream and predatory serpents slithered across cold marble, Medusa was a human girl of unparalleled grace. Her allure was not aggressive or loud. It simply existed as an unavoidable reality, like morning light piercing through a dark tomb. Her hair fell in heavy waves like woven midnight. Her eyes possessed the surreal calm of a sleeping ocean before a hurricane, and her mere presence sent a tremor through kings and immortals alike. She was born into a lineage of ancient terrors, in an era where monsters were venerated and feared in equal measure. Her siblings, Stheno and Euryale, were primordial, fierce, and engineered for slaughter. But Medusa was an anomaly. She alone was bound to a mortal lifespan. She alone could bleed, and perhaps that fragile, fleeting nature made her far more precious than her immortal bloodline. Yet, she desired no throne, no celestial suitors, no crown of divine favor. She pursued something infinitely rarer, absolute devotion. As a young woman, she crossed the threshold into the sacred service of Athena, the unyielding goddess of intellect, warfare, and severe restraint. Within the cavernous stone sanctuary constructed upon the jagged cliffs overlooking the sea, Medusa maintained the altars, ignited the heavy incense, and offered her voice to the dark long before the dawn could break. She accepted the strict vows of celibacy, isolation, and silence, not under the weight of coercion, but out of a pure, unyielding belief in the ideal. She did not merely revere Athena as a patron. She viewed her as an anchor, an entity existing far above the chaotic, bleeding desires of mortal hearts. As the seasons dissolved, the common people began to whisper that the young priestess was a living manifestation of the goddess herself. Worshippers would enter the temple, pretending to offer sacrifice while stealing glances at her quiet form. Her countenance became an idealized symbol, her voice a rare melody, her entire existence anchored to the sacred architecture. But beauty, even when cloaked in holy vestments, is an invitation for predators. The rumors of her untouchable grace bled far beyond the temple parameters, drifting past city walls and through the deep forests until they breached the golden halls of Olympus. With that recognition came a predatory shadow, for in the kingdom of the gods, desire frequently wore an aggressive, immortal face, and the boundary between reverence and theft was razor-thin. One particular ruler of the pantheon took notice. Not a lord of intellect, not a master of restraint, but an entity of the deep oceans, violent tempests, and insatiable hunger. And while Medusa remained faithful to her vows, the strings of fate were already tightening around her throat. In the realm of the absolute, even innocence can be interpreted as a crime, and soon, her sanctuary would mutate into an inescapable cage. Deep beneath the crushing tides and coral monoliths of the abyss, Poseidon commanded the seas with an arrogant fury and a hunger that the oceans could never satisfy. He had broken monsters, conjured cataclysms, and claimed immortal queens. But his focus had now shifted toward a fragile piece of dust. Medusa, her physical perfection, had become a topic of conversation among the stars. Yet it was her absolute stillness, her rigorous discipline, and her untouchable boundaries that truly consumed his mind. She belonged to no mortal king, no heroic conqueror, no lesser deity. She had constructed her life around a devotion that removed her from the board of desire, and that absolute refusal was what tempted the sea god above all else. The more she prayed, the more his shadow lengthened across her sanctuary. One evening, when the tide rose with an unnatural violence and the temple was vacant of worshippers, Poseidon emerged from the black surf. He did not seek entrance. The masters of Olympus rarely request permission. He crossed the threshold of Athena's holy house, the dark ocean water pulling beneath his heavy strides, leaving a trail of briny decay across the pristine stone floors. Medusa, alone and entirely defenseless, turned only to find the colossal god looming in the shadows of the altar. His trident was absent, but his hunger filled the room. She screamed for her protector, but her voice merely bounced off the unyielding architecture without an answer. She fled, but sanctuaries built for contemplation were never designed as escape routes. And there, beneath the stone gaze of Athena's central monument, the Lord of the Deep defiled what was sacred. It was no seduction. It was a brutal violation of flesh and spirit. When the violence concluded, Poseidon dissolved back into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the scent of salt and an absolute, suffocating silence. Medusa, broken and bleeding, curled tightly at the base of her goddess's icon, waiting for a savior, waiting for divine justice, waiting for any sign that her devotion mattered. But the high powers do not answer to the broken. When Athena finally returned to her desecrated home and looked upon the ruin, her fury exploded across the hall. But her rage was not directed at her brother of the sea. It was aimed directly at the victim. Whether driven by an arrogant pride, a refusal to challenge a fellow Olympian, or the rigid laws of her own dogma, Athena held her priestess accountable for the defilement of the temple. Whether she viewed Medusa as a willing participant or merely an inconvenient stain did not alter the outcome. The structural purity of her house had been compromised. And so the goddess of reason passed a terrifying sentence, not upon the sovereign who had committed the crime, but upon the mortal who had endured it. Because within the architecture of myth, power always insulates itself, and the girl who was once a monument to holy beauty would now be twisted into a warning that humanity would never forget. The stone floor was still wet with the residue of the sea when the goddess manifested. The holy incense had long turned to cold ash. The stillness was oppressive, and at its center, Medusa knelt in absolute humiliation, her head pressed against the flagstones beneath the unblinking, emerald stare of her master. But Athena's gaze held no mercy. It burned with a cold, intellectual rage. Her sanctuary of logic, discipline, and absolute purity had been ruined. And though an immortal had crossed that line, it was the mortal who would carry the brand. To an entity like Athena, there was no room for nuance. The high thrones never offer apologies, and the temples never absolve a stain. The retribution had to be symbolic, absolute, and eternal. She stepped down from her elevated pedestal, towering over the trembling girl who still anticipated some shred of protection from the deity she had served since childhood. That protection never arrived. Instead, Athena's voice reverberated through the marble chamber like a clap of iron thunder. "You have brought a profound rot into my domain. Let the cosmos witness the true nature of beauty that invites ruin." With a single, dismissive movement, she touched the priestess's forehead. The mutation was immediate and agonizing. Her golden hair dissolved, twisting into hundreds of writhing, venomous serpents, their sharp hissing a cruel mockery of the prayers she had whispered in the dark. The warmth evaporated from her skin, turning it the color of a corpse. Her gaze transformed into a weapon of absolute destruction. Her eyes, which had once held the soft sorrow of the ocean, now possessed a catastrophic power. Anyone who dared to look into them would instantly turn to stone. Not just enemies, not just invaders, any living soul. It was not a curse designed to protect her. It was a sentence of absolute isolation, a permanent imprisonment masquerading as a defense mechanism. Medusa shrieked, but the sound that escaped her throat was no longer human. Her tears, once salt water, dried into ash before they could track down her face. Her breath grew cold. Her image shattered every mirror she approached. And worst of all, she could no longer look upon another living entity without condemning them to an eternal, mineral silence. Athena did not weep for her servant. She did not turn her face away in shame. She simply observed as her most loyal priestess was systematically dismantled into a monster. The great doors of the sanctuary slammed shut behind Medusa as she fled into the wilderness, her monstrous cries echoing through the lonely hills. No home remained for her, no holy altars, no family, no prayers, only a trail of stone statues left in her wake. And from the high cliffs of Mount Olympus, Athena returned to her throne, completely unmoved. For in the calculations of the immortals, justice is irrelevant. Only the preservation of order matters, and Medusa's new face would outlast the memory of her innocence. Exiled from both the sacred temples and the mortal cities, Medusa wandered into the uncharted wilderness, a creature cursed and universally dreaded. Her footsteps carved a trail of petrified life across the continent. A single, accidental glance at a passing bird mid-flight brought it crashing down as lifeless marble. A deer resting in the brush, even the insects that crossed her path, were frozen forever in an absolute stillness. She sought a sanctuary where no hero would ever dare to follow, crossing the distant rivers and moving past ancient ruins until she reached a bleak, windswept island at the absolute edge of the map, a forgotten rock untouched by either gods or men. There, she constructed no shelter. What value was a roof when the stars offered nothing but silent judgment? What value were walls when her divine protectors had been the ones to hand her over to the dark? The cavern she claimed as her home was already partially filled with monuments, long-forgotten warriors, wild predators, or perhaps even lost travelers who had looked upon her face for a fraction of a second too long. And so began her second existence, not as a holy servant, but as a universal pariah. Medusa no longer wept. Tears belonged to the innocent girl she had left behind on the temple floor. The girl who believed in divine justice, who burned incense for Athena, who foolishly thought that loyalty could buy security. That girl had been murdered by her own goddess. In her place stood an entirely different entity, not a monster of malice, but a woman thoroughly shaped by betrayal. Her serpents whispered to her during her fitful dreams, communicating not in language, but in raw, animal instinct, warnings of distant intruders, echoes of approaching boots, the vibrations of weapon steel. Her hair had become her only vanguard, her eyes her permanent cage, her soul a dying ember of memory. She began to claw images into the rough walls of her cave. Faces she once knew, human hands, the outlines of the temple she had once protected. Even the memories of her sisters were beginning to evaporate into the dark, and stone was the only medium she had left to hold on to her sanity. Occasionally, arrogant heroes would breach her shores, lured by tales of a cursed creature or tempted by the legendary glory of slaying a monster. They arrived with iron shields and righteous anger, believing they were eradicating evil from the earth. But none of them ever saw the sunset again. They fundamentally misunderstood her. They underestimated her power, yes, but more than that, they completely underestimated the unyielding strength of her pain. Yet, with every intruder who found an eternal monument on her shores, Medusa felt her identity shifting. She was becoming the very nightmare the world had manufactured. Her humanity had not been entirely extinguished, but it was receding like a low tide, and the creators of her torment had long since averted their eyes. Far from her desolate cave, within the teeming plazas and polished marble sanctuaries of Greece, her narrative began to mutate. Her name was no longer uttered in mourning. It passed through the mouths of men like a contagious disease, twisted, rewritten, and weaponized. Medusa the Gorgon, Medusa the venomous temptress, Medusa, whose singular glance reduces the living to mineral ash. Her history as a devoted servant, a human girl who spent her mornings washing the altars of the sky, was systematically buried beneath the weight of myth. In its place rose a caricature of Malice, a predatory beast with a skull of snakes, her eyes holding the complete vengeance of the underworld. The scribes did not document Poseidon's violence. The poets deliberately omitted Athena's savage retribution. The roles of the Olympians were carefully edited, smoothed over by priests who demanded that their gods remain spotless and their monsters clearly defined. Children were warned into obedience with her name. Phalanxes carved her snarl into their iron shields, not to honor her endurance, but to mock her ruin. Her face became the universal architecture of dread, a morality tale for the weak, and yet her image was replicated everywhere. Potters painted her across clay urns. Her distorted silhouette danced through the mosaics of wealthy estates. Her screaming likeness was etched into the very temple walls that had cast her out, serving as a protective ward for the gods who had ruined her. From her absolute isolation, Medusa could feel the crushing weight of their vocabulary. She had never campaigned to become a legend. She had never asked to be feared. She had merely survived. And survival, to those who sit upon absolute thrones, is an inherent threat. On the mainland, however, a few fractured voices refused the empire's narrative. Old women in remote mountain villages left small, secret offerings near deep caverns, whispering that Medusa stood as a guardian for women who had been broken by power. They did not fear her monstrosity. They pitied her betrayal. They named her the protector of the wronged. But those murmurs were fragile, effortlessly drowned out by the thunderous roar of heroic epics. Medusa remained hidden in the dark, unaware of how violently her legacy had been fractured. A monster to the rulers, a martyr to the broken. What she did understand was the inevitability of the steel. No matter how deep she buried herself, the opportunists would keep arriving. Men carrying iron swords and mirror-bright armor. Men who truly believed that slaughtering a pariah would buy them an immortal name. Men who never cared who she had been, only what she had been forced to become. And somewhere in the Peloponnese, her executioner was already drawing his first breath. A child who would grow into a celebrated soldier, a heroic icon, and her final visitor. While Medusa endured her exile, her reputation spreading like a wildfire across the Aegean. A boy named Perseus was born into a different iteration of silence, a prison constructed from prophecy. His mother, Danae, had been locked within a subterranean bronze chamber by her own father, King Acrisius, who was desperate to disrupt a decree from the fates that her offspring would one day claim his life. But the masters of Olympus do not respect mortal architecture. Zeus descended upon Danae not with a lover's touch, but as a torrential downpour of liquid gold, slipping past the heavy locks and royal warnings. From that cosmic violation, Perseus was born. When the king discovered the child, cowardice prevented him from executing a son of the Sky King directly. Instead, he sealed the mother and her infant inside a wooden chest and cast them out into the black currents of the sea. A quiet execution wrapped in royal deniability. But the tides, directed by the hand of Poseidon, ferried them away from death and toward a quiet refuge. They washed ashore on the jagged coast of Seriphos, where a common fisherman offered them a home. Danae raised the boy in absolute anonymity, instructing him in the virtues of endurance, humility, and the quiet survival of the displaced. She never uttered the name of Zeus. She never revealed to the boy what manner of entity had sired him. The seasons dissolved, and Perseus matured into a sharp-eyed youth, clever, powerful, but entirely untested by the world. Then came Polydex, the ruthless tyrant of Seriphos. He desired Danae for his bed, and Perseus stood as an unyielding barrier to that ambition. masking his malice behind a facade of royal generosity. The king invited the young man to a grand banquet where every guest was expected to present a horse as a tribute. Perseus, impoverished and blinded by a young man's pride, arrived with empty hands. Polydex sneered before the gathered court. "Then bring me the skull of the Gorgon Medusa." A wave of mocking laughter rattled the hall. It was a command engineered to humiliate him, to send him to his death. But Perseus, stung by the insult and completely ignorant of the history behind that name, accepted the terms. The gods observed the declaration with immediate interest. Athena, perhaps still harboring a cold, divine residual guilt over the desecration of her temple, saw a strategic opportunity. She would assist this young demigod, not to deliver justice, but to restore a calculated balance to the mythos. Alongside Hermes, she entered Perseus's dreams, whispering the logistics of the hunt. They gifted him the instruments of execution: winged sandals to carve through the sky, a polished bronze shield to act as a mirror, an adamantine blade capable of severing divine bone, and the shadow helm of Hades to grant him absolute invisibility. Yet, no gift from Olympus is ever free of a hidden agenda. Perseus had been selected not simply to eradicate a beast, but to complete a narrative, one that had begun long before his birth, with a lonely girl kneeling on a marble floor, crying out to gods who were too proud to listen. Perseus departed with the weapons of the sky at his hip and the weight of a tyrant's malice upon his shoulders. But tracking the Gorgon was not as simple as navigating a charted sea. Her coordinates had been buried by the passing of centuries, intentionally concealed even from the lesser deities of the pantheon. To map her location, the youth required answers that no mortal mind could hold. He sought out the Grii, three ancient sisters who existed as a singular consciousness, sharing a solitary eye and a single tooth among them. They were entities older than the Olympians, draped in rotting shadow and ancient spite, residing in the gray void between light and nightmare. They knew exactly where Medusa slept, for they were bound to her by ancient blood. Perseus did not offer prayers. He did not bargain. He waited in the freezing dark until one sister removed the eye to pass it to the next, and snatched the wet orb directly from their fingers. "Reveal the coordinates," he demanded, holding their only window to reality hostage, "or remain blind until the end of time." They hissed against the cold, but their voices finally broke. They spoke of a distant, windswept rock existing far beyond mortal maps, past jagged reefs that tore ships into splinters, where petrified men littered the coastline like fallen battalions. An island where the birds refused to sing and the stars chose to ignore. The cage of Medusa. And so Perseus took to the air, his sandals slicing through the clouds, his pulse hammering not with terror, but with the raw anticipation of victory. He already envisioned his return to Seriphos, the severed skull held high in his hands, Danae safe, Polydex brought to his knees. He had not yet questioned the morality of the contract he had signed. He believed what the priests had written, that Medusa was an abomination, and that her death was a necessity for the order of the world. The gods had weaponized him perfectly, but they had intentionally left him unvarnished. They had not informed him that her cavern was carpeted with the remains of men who had used that same vocabulary of heroism. They had not explained that her eyes were not cruel, but merely carrying a curse. And they had certainly not revealed that her countenance beneath the snakes, behind the suffocating myth, still retained the delicate architecture of a woman who had once loved the sky. As he tore through the maritime winds, the gale howled with an unnatural violence, as if trying to warn him. But Perseus heard only an empty silence, a silence the gods always employ when they construct a monster. Because the last thing an empire wants is for someone to hear the abomination speak. When his sandals touched the gray sand of the island, the universe seemed to hold its breath. There was no wind, no movement of water, only the statues. Hundreds of them were scattered across the cliffs and deep crags, looking like a shattered army frozen in the middle of a strategic retreat. Their features were twisted into absolute, primal horror, mouths locked mid-shriek, eyes dilated with the image of their final second on Earth. He stepped carefully over petrified limbs and shattered bronze shields, his sword remaining in its sheath, his hand tightening around the mirrored surface of the shield. Athena's warning echoed in his mind. Never look upon her directly. Use the reflection. Be swift. Be silent. But what the goddess had neglected to mention was the look of profound surprise carrying through those stone faces. It was as though, in the absolute fraction of a second before they turned to mineral, these men had realized they were fundamentally wrong about what they were hunting. Perseus moved deeper into the subterranean vault, his mechanical wings folding flat against his back. The air within the chamber was thick with damp moss, the sharp musk of reptiles, and a third element that choked his throat, an overwhelming, ancient sorrow. The serpents hissed before he could even register her silhouette. It was a low, synchronized symphony of exhaustion and warning. Then she materialized in the reflection, not charging from the dark, not roaring with a beast's fury, completely unaware of his presence. Medusa was asleep, coiled upon a cold slab of stone, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest like a frightened child. Her face, caught in the bronze mirror of his shield, appeared peaceful, remarkably fragile. A strange, haunting beauty lingered beneath her features, half hidden by the tangle of venomous reptiles that rested in a temporary slumber. She did not look like an abomination. She looked like someone who had been abandoned by every force in the universe. Perseus hesitated, the adamantine sword heavy in his grip. This was not the roaring monster celebrated in the halls of kings, nor the terrifying image painted onto the pottery of Athens. She was merely a cursed woman, asleep and utterly alone in the dark. But the contracts of the gods are non-negotiable. He remembered his mother's captivity. He remembered the mocking face of the tyrant. He remembered the promise of glory. He raised the blade, his eyes fixed firmly on the reflection. He took a solitary step forward. A single serpent lifted its head from the cluster, its tongue tasting the air. Medusa stirred, her eyelids fluttering, though her gaze remained closed. She did not shriek. She did not strike. She barely even drew breath. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, Perseus struck. The adamantine edge hissed through the damp air, carrying the absolute weight of a divine decree. An oppressive silence immediately reclaimed the cave. When her head fell into the satchel lined with bronze scales, the entire island seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The curse had reached its conclusion, or so the hero believed, because you can systematically slaughter a body, but you cannot kill the trajectory of a story. And Medusa's true legacy was only just beginning to take root. Perseus did not remain within the tomb. Securing the satchel, its lethal contents still pulsing with an unholy power even in death, he launched himself back into the sky. His sandals beat rhythmically against the clouds, but the absolute, cold silence of that island refused to leave his skin. It was not the silence of a glorious victory. It was something infinitely colder. The satchel throbbed against his hip. Though severed from the torso, the blood of the victim refused to go quiet. The severed snakes within the bronze-lined satchel continued to writhe, their forks of tongue flickering blindly as they interrogated the boundaries of their canvas prison. Her eyes remained wide, frozen in a permanent, unblinking glare, still fully capable of instantly petrifying any living creature that dared to peer into the dark. Perseus did not look. He dared not. The architects of Olympus had provided him with a flawless instrument, an absolute trump card against the mortal world. Yet, as he tracked across the clouds, a cold unease began to seep into his chest. Beneath him, deep in the ocean swells, pale things shifted in the black water. His act, though celebrated as a triumph in the city-states, had violently disturbed an ancient equilibrium. The balance of power had shifted. Poseidon registered the fracture. Athena calculated the consequences. the fates continued to weave their silent tapestry. Far above the peak of Olympus, a celestial storm began to gather its strength. Still, the youth pressed onward, his mind desperately focusing on the logistics of his return. He would descend upon Seriphos. He would silence King Polydex, liberate his mother from her chains, and secure his name across history. He would be a hero. That was the unyielding promise of the epics. But the literal weight against his hip told a different narrative. He found himself returning to the reflection in his polished shield, the image of her face before the iron descended. She had not snarled. She had not lunged with predatory malice. She had been completely asleep. Had he truly eradicated an abomination, or had he systematically executed a warning wrapped in human misunderstanding? He forced the thought from his mind. The gods had orchestrated his path, hadn't they? Yet, as the maritime winds grew more aggressive, Perseus noticed a strange vibration. The satchel was humming. It was not an audible sound, but a rhythmic pulse against his flesh. It was as though the severed skull still held a residual memory of the light, as though the spirit of Medusa, systematically betrayed, mutilated, and isolated, still looked outward, still aware, still waiting. And though Perseus would go on to navigate empires, slaughter beasts, and see his name written into the constellations, he would never again experience a peaceful night. Because sometimes, when the candles burned down to ash, he swore he could hear the faint, dry rattle of scales shifting beneath his bed. And sometimes, his mind did not conjure images of his grand triumphs, but of a young girl kneeling in the dark, begging her goddess for a protection that would never come. Perseus entered the royal palace of Seriphos carrying the salt spray of the sea, his divine armor reflecting the torchlight, the skull of a legend concealed beneath the heavy folds of his cloak. The common people greeted him with thunderous acclaim, completely ignorant of what lay within the bronze scales of the bag, ignorant of the price extracted to buy their security. But King Polydex was no fool. He had designed the quest as a death sentence wrapped in administrative mockery. He had never anticipated the boy's return. When the youth strode into the crowded grand hall, his head held high, the tyrant's arrogant sneer faltered into a tense stillness. "You claim to have brought me a tribute?" Polydex mocked, his voice straining to maintain control over the court. Perseus offered a single glacial nod, a direct fulfillment of your request. With a swift, unyielding motion, he tore open the satchel. For a fraction of a second, Polydex met the unblinking stare of Medusa. A single second was all the cosmic law required. A pale frost of stone erupted across his skin, cracking through his flesh like ice over stagnant water. His eyes froze wide in a permanent state of terror, his final breath trapped behind lips that had hardened into solid granite. The sovereign who had been so smug, so casually cruel, was instantly reduced to an anonymous decorative statue. The grand hall exploded into panic. Courtiers scrambled for the exits, while others fell to their knees in the dirt. Perseus stood in absolute silence, his features unreadable, a monument of his own making. Danae rushed forward, throwing her arms around her son, finally liberated from her exile. Yet, even in the warmth of her embrace, Perseus maintained an absolute silence regarding the girl in the cavern. To his mother, to the court, to the empire, Medusa was merely a monster conquered, an obstacle neutralized by heroic intervention. No one questioned who she had been before the snakes. But Perseus remembered. He remembered the physical collapse of her body, and the way her reflected face had not carried fury, but a desperate plea. The narrative expanded rapidly across the Aegean. Rhapsodes composed epics, altars were constructed, and Perseus was named the Gorgon Slayer, the champion of reason, the breaker of curses. They chiseled his name into the white marble of temples, never once allowing her name to be carved beside his triumph. In his twilight years, acting under a direct command from the sky, the hero surrendered the relic to Athena. Her countenance, once condemned to the dark, was now fixed permanently to the bronze curve of the goddess's shield, the Aegis. Her ruined face was turned outward, transformed into a weapon of divine enforcement. But it was not justice for Medusa, it was justice for the empire. Even in death, she was forced to serve the architecture that had broken her. Even in absolute silence, her trauma was weaponized. For decades, the golden hero marched beneath that shield, securing every victory through the frozen terror of the woman he had executed. He was universally loved. She was universally feared, and neither entity possessed the power to alter the script the gods had written for them. When Athena claimed the prize, she did not seek the winged sandals or the adamantine blade. She demanded only the contents of the satchel. Affixing the severed head to her central buckler, she transformed her former servant into a legendary engine of war. Wherever the goddess of wisdom marched, slaughter followed in her wake. Entire phalanxes turned to stone at a glance. Cities collapsed into rubble. The image of the Aegis was stamped onto the currency of empires and carved into the gates of strongholds. Her shield became both a banner of victory and an absolute threat. Yet, the histories never recorded why the girl had been transformed into a monster. Athena carried the face of the woman she had ruined, not as an act of contrition or a manifestation of guilt, but as a raw display of sovereignty, a testament to what occurs when dust challenges the sky. Still, a few fractured whispers defied the temple orthodoxy. Some argued that the goddess was not exploiting a weapon, but granting Medusa an ironic variation of immortality. By placing her upon the central axis of her authority, she ensured that Medusa could never be erased from the cultural memory. The girl who had once cried out in an empty sanctuary was now etched into the eternal fabric of the cosmos, forcing even the gods to carry the evidence of their actions before the world. But the truth, as it always is with the high thrones, was layered in profound paradox. Athena had condemned her priestess for bringing shame into her house, and now she wielded that exact shame as her greatest trophy. The transition was absolute. Medusa had been a priestess, then a victim, then an abomination, and finally an icon. Yet, somewhere within the curve of that petrified jaw, within the deep sorrow of those mineral eyes, something survived that the world could not systematically erase. Because even as her gaze reduced armies to ash, there were always a few, a quiet, desperate few, who looked upon her image and did not see a monster. They saw an interrogation. They saw a protest. They saw a permanent warning. And that is a power no divine blade could ever hope to sever. For centuries, armies marched blindly behind the image of her trauma, unaware that the face weaponized to protect empires once belonged to a woman who had never raised her hand in violence. Her voice had been entirely extinguished, but her eyes continued to bear witness. She watched dynasties rise from the mud and fall back into it. She saw the great marble temples crumble into dust. She observed heroes turn cruel with power, and she watched altars rise to the very men who had branded her an abomination. And occasionally, her gaze met the eyes of women who understood exactly what she had lost. In the dark corners of the world, those women left small, secret offerings at forgotten shrines. A tiny serpent molded from river clay, a lock of hair wrapped in plain cloth, a name whispered into the earth where the priests could not hear. They did not approach her out of fear, they approached her out of remembrance. Because long before she was used as a cautionary tale, Medusa had become a strange kind of protector. Her cavern had been a graveyard for conquerors, yes, but it had also been a sanctuary, a place where no man could cross the threshold and survive, a boundary where the hunted became entirely untouchable. With the passage of time, her myth began to fracture. To the rulers, she remained the Gorgon. To the displaced, she mutated into a symbol of absolute resistance, a deity of righteous wrath and wounded justice, a spirit standing firmly between the vulnerable and the predator. The narrative bent and turned, but the core refused to dissolve. A woman wronged, A woman systematically reshaped by pain. A woman whose biography had been stolen, but whose stare could never be taken away. Her image endured across paintings, sculptures, shields, coins, and the collective nightmare of humanity. And in every generation, someone new would pause before her likeness. Someone would look into those stone eyes and ask the forbidden question, was she truly the monster? And in that singular question, Medusa lived again. Centuries dissolved into history. Vast empires crumbled into ruins. New deities rose to dominance and fell into obscurity. But Medusa remained, not as physical flesh, but as a permanent shadow across the human consciousness. Her image migrated across disparate cultures, chiseled into the stone of Byzantium, cast in the bronze of Rome, surviving just beneath the surface of official memory. But a significant shift occurred as the ages lengthened. The narrative split completely. In the Orthodox text, she remained the beast, the serpent-haired killer of the waste. Her likeness became a talisman against evil, mounted above the gates of fortresses and forged into the armor of kings, soldiers hoping her reputation would strike a deeper terror than the edge of a spear. But an alternative history quietly matured alongside the myth, a history whispered by poets, philosophers, and women whose perspectives were excluded from the official scrolls. In this version, Medusa was not a creature to be hunted, but a human soul systematically broken by power, punished for her grace, and cursed for a violation committed against her. This version did not roar, it murmured in the dark. It questioned why a goddess of reason would execute her own servant. It demanded to know why the Lord of the Sea faced no consequence for his violence. It asked why a line of men sought to slaughter a woman who simply demanded to be left alone in the quiet. In remote taverns, in private libraries, in the cracks of crumbling altars, those questions bloomed like weeds breaking through marble. And slowly, the mirror of Medusa shifted its angle. She ceased to be a reflection of terror. She became a mirror of truth. The broken began to recognize their own features within her silhouette. The survivors of violence, the victims of systemic silence, the souls branded as dangerous simply because they refused to be broken twice. Her crown of serpents was no longer interpreted as a brand of shame, but as a sovereign crown. Her gaze was no longer viewed as a curse, but as a defense mechanism sharpened by absolute betrayal. Even now, within the art and stories of the modern era, Medusa returns to the light, not to petrify the living, but to testify against the past. She looks out from the canvas with a mixture of profound grief and unyielding fury. Her myth is no longer retold to elevate the glory of Perseus, but to interrogate the very nature of his heroism. Because stories evolve, and sometimes the true monster is not the creature carrying the fangs, but the entity holding the sword. And in every generation that possesses the courage to challenge the ancient script, Medusa blinks just once in the dark and watches them finally begin to understand.